Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes in between this and the next. So I want to give you a little heads up on what is coming up. We're going to do a little panel for you, and that's going to give you the opportunity to ask any questions that you have in this space in the Discord channel if you would like to. So please get on in there. If if you are not there already, ask your questions. It's a nice opportunity to have a chat with a bunch of us who are interested in this area. We are going to be chatting amongst ourselves, and having you along is fun and is part of it. But if there are things you want to guide us to, questions that you want to ask, anything you want to ask us or have us discuss, then that's the purpose of the panel. And our theme today is all about open source documentation and the tools that we use for open source documentation. So with that, I think I will start introducing my panel. So people are appearing. Here's Scott. Okay, so first up, Scott, Riley, you each need to wave when it's your turn. This is Scott. So Scott is the author of a book called Mindful Design, and he does design and product at Gitbook. So yeah, that's you. Okay, cool. And then we'll also introduce you to Cameron Shorter, who's one of the coordinators at the Good Docs project. Thank you, Cameron. And you already know about Jen. Okay, we don't need to introduce Jen. You already know about Jen. That is fantastic. So this is your panel for tonight. Questions, start typing. And I'll open by just asking each of you to say a little bit more about what brought you here to the meeting of open source and documentation. Where have you been that brought you to here? Scott, you can go.
Yeah, sorry, I was unmuting myself. Yeah, so I think a big part of it is simply the fact that it's not my job. That always helps when you work for a documentation tool and it's your job to make it better. I think as well, documentation to me is a really interesting entry point to a project, because I think there'll be opportunity to talk a bit more about this when we get chatting, but I think there's a lot of kind of storytelling that can be done around a project. There's a lot of empowerment that can come from good documentation. I've always enjoyed writing, the written word. I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, unfortunately for everyone watching right now. But yeah, I think it's a really good, as someone who's been a designer, my whole career, it's kind of like the melting point of a lot of things that I'm interested in, like the written word, how we as humans kind of react to storytelling, and how, this is writing for a purpose, right? It's not writing for enjoyment, or it's not writing for introspection. There's a reason, there's a design behind why people write documentation. So yeah, I think all those things has kind of really interested me for a long time, and I'm very fortunate now to kind of be designing the tools that hopefully get that out of people, or at least give them a platform to do so.
That sounds really great. Okay, Cameron, your turn.
Cool. So I'm a software engineer originally, and moved into open source, and then sort of started up a couple of open source projects, and sort of moved into the bits that other people weren't doing, and guess what? That was documentation. And so we sort of developed processes, and eventually I got to a point where I said, hey, let's go in and find out what the best practices are around documentation. And I looked and I asked, and it's like, nowhere do you have the sort of quality of standards as you have in software engineering or project management, or, there's bits of, pieces all over the place, bits on the web over here where someone's written this great article that everyone refers to, but nothing that brings it all together into sort of like standards. And that's, so we stood back and said, well, if no one's done it, then maybe we should step up. And we created the Good Docs project specifically to go in and build templates to describe how to write a how to write a tutorial. What is, just pull all these great articles that are out there into one point to make it easy to access. And it's a journey, and we're iterating, and we're trying to get better as we go along, and we're trying to get these best ideas, and we're trying to get the people who have these great ideas, and we found a bunch of them. We want a bunch more. I probably should stop here, and we can come back to that a little bit later.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I'm a big fan of the Good Docs project. I have some very cute stickers from there. It's not the only reason I like it, but just putting it out there. Jen, we've heard a bit about your interests already, but I do want to hear from you, kind of like what brought you to here to work on this project and in the wider space.
Yeah. So I had done a lot of creative writing and article writing before I became a developer. It was a career change for me. To be part of tech. And what kind of brought me especially to open source and working on documentation was that I was, for a time, the only front-end developer at a small startup. And so I was extremely reliant on the documentation to be my teacher and to be my guide. I had incredible coworkers who would sit with me and help debug and help rubber duck and like really dig in and try to figure it out. But a lot of it was about reading and reading and reading again. So there was sort of a natural opportunity to start making some improvements as I saw things that were confusing or had problems. And that kind of morphed into being involved in documentation, writing long-term, and trying to build up that skill set.
I love it. I think I came at it the other way around as maybe more of a coder and now a writer. And I've always liked to write, but I am definitely more of an open source engineer, and a little bit like Cameron. If no one else is writing the documentation and it needs doing, you sort of get into it and then you get better at it. I prefer to write than speak. Again, it's kind of more my thing. And now I'm a developer advocate, so great documentation is part of a great developer experience. It's a key communication skill. So it's something that I really enjoy mixing in with my technical skills. Outside of work, I maintain the RST2 PDF project. Does what it sounds like, takes restricted text, outputs PDF, hopefully no surprises. And I'm a maintainer of that because I use it for all my slide decks, separating content and presentation. PDF is also the right format for all presentations ever, just saying. And the project was abandoned. So I didn't create this project. I am not entirely sure how it works. It's quite old, but I didn't want it to die. So now I'm a maintainer, and that's something that I bring to it, and I try and look after the tool, and we've done quite a lot with it in the time, myself and my co-maintainer. So I'm coming at it from a bunch of different angles. It was really nice to have all of you to chat with and to hear a little bit more about today. So a few questions coming in, and if you're watching, then type some into Discord, and I will interrogate all these people or answer it myself as they come through. So I think we should start with our favorite documentation. Is there like one particular set that you think is really good or that you often use as a reference? Do you have a favorite? Cameron's nodding at me. Go on, Cameron, share your secrets.
Actually, no, there is no perfect documentation. And let me caveat that. And there's actually a really good article that someone did, Daniel Procura, I think his name is, where he went in and said, there is no one thing called good documentation. There's actually 4. And he then divides it down into how-to documents, conceptual documents, tutorials, and API reference guides. And when you go in and define for one of, like if you write according to one of them, then you are going to be using wrong best practices that you have for another. And as a consequence, you should actually go in and write your documentation differently for each one. It's probably best, I'll give an example. A tutorial is something where you don't want your reader to fall off the rails. You've got to really focus on making sure that it is well written. It doesn't need to be talking about the latest software. It doesn't need to cover every use case, but it needs to be good and safe. Reference documentation, it actually doesn't matter if the writing's not very good. It just needs to be accurate, and it also needs to be up to date with the latest software. And so you've got two different criteria here, and you weight them differently. And you should actually be thinking about this as you're designing a documentation plan. Sorry, I'll hand over from here.
I'll jump in. I'm going to get roasted for not mentioning a Gitbook documentation, but I think the Svelte.js docs are really good. And I think what's good about them is like a project like Svelte, which is kind of going up, not so much competing, but like it's going to be held in the same kind of sphere as people chatting about React and similar front-end frameworks. And I think when you're like new to that and you've got really cool ideas, which Svelte does have, you need to get folks on board, and you need to get them creating stuff with your tool, with your product, with your platform, wherever it is. You need to get them creating stuff and realizing the impact of what they can create, right? And I think the way Svelte does that, I don't know if there's been a link shared to the docs, but it's really good. You get a sandbox environment to check it out. It does, if you followed some of the references in Svelte, you get basically the documentation alongside a code playground where you can see, okay, this is how we would write it with the information that you knew in the previous step. Now we'll teach you this concept, and you can see how this code would look now that you've learned the new concept. So I think, though, obviously it's very specific to the goal, and I would agree with Cameron, there's no like perfect documentation, because folks who just want an API reference, they're not going to want to go through an interactive tutorial or a code playground necessarily to just have a reference point for what this method does or anything like that. But I think in terms of how it approaches the problem and how much it recognizes and leads into this is the intended use case of our documentation, I think, yeah, it's as close to perfect as I've seen in terms of onboarding me into a new tool to kind of replace something I was entrenched in before. So yeah, I think really worth highlighting Svelte docs.
So one of my favorites on the tutorial side, it changed the way that I thought about documentation, is Jen Looper and the Vue Vixens have these little short tutorials that you build something, you get very quickly to building something delightful. And it kind of changed how I thought of documentation. Like I was thinking, okay, well, the thing that I struggle with the most in learning any library is the mental model. Therefore, let me try to share the mental model. And inverting that is something that I have carried into other types of documentation as well. If we're talking about documentation of the function itself.
I love that all of you talked about the different types of documentation and the way that the different types are used, or that you relate differently to different types of documentation. Do you think we should have different people specializing in creating different types of documentation? Yeah, Scott, opinions?
Yeah, I think so. I think everyone has like their skills and their expertise, and I think trying to like force people down a path of document something they necessarily on in a style they're not comfortable with is really important. I also think it applies to, having a diverse range of types of documentation as well. Some people learn in different ways. Some people have kind of neuroatypical mental processes that mean that things like long videos are difficult to process, but text articles are easy to process. Some people are the exact opposite, and they can watch a video at 2.5 times speed and learn, the history of the whole world in the space of an afternoon. And I think having folks who are capable of those different styles is great, especially if you are kind of really building up a team around documentation and really able to put resources into it. I think absolutely focusing on the different approaches to learning and understanding the blockers and the strengths that, you know, different types of humans have when it comes to processing information. You don't get that if you necessarily, I don't want to be exclusive with this, but I don't think you get that if you try too hard to generalize. I think focusing more on specific, you know, types of learning and people who are great at creating that type of content is really good.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Firstly, I want to agree with what Scott's saying, but I want to add a counterpoint, which is going to say exact opposite. In that, I think that we as communities quite often have a tendency to say, "Oh, documentation is too hard. Someone else should do that," and most developers can write really good documentation, especially if you give them a template. And there's a formula that I've used over and over again in open source communities, and I've run into other communities that have successfully done this and come to the same conclusion independently. Is you go and create a template, and you get your tech writers and your domain experts to come in and write best practices and embed it into the template. You give the template to your experts, typically your software engineers in our case, and they go in and they write pretty good documentation if you give them a good template. And for a lot of the documentation, that's actually good enough what they come out with. And if you want that extra bit of polish, you then go and get a tech writer to come in afterwards and review the content against that template. And that's actually a really simple workflow, which comes out with really good results at the end and enables the workload to be spread across lots of people and lifts the quality of your whole community.
For me, I think that it is totally fine for people to have specializations and lean into what those are. It's also totally fine for people to walk across and work in like different areas of the documentation than they're used to. Usually the conversations I have with open source contributors is like, I ask, what do you want to learn? What do you want to get better at? What do you want to take away from this? An ideal open source volunteering experience isn't just like give. Like there's got to be something else that comes into play there for that person to be able to justify continuing to invest their time. And like, I want to know what that is and lean into it. So I have found that a lot of times the best documentation within the Ember community, at least, has come from collaborations between two people with really different skill sets. Like some of the really incredible tools that we have for checking to make sure our tutorial is, all the code is valid in that tutorial, all of the code runs as you copy paste it, came out of those types of partnerships. And so like whenever possible, I advise people to use the buddy system when they're working on things or trying out something new.
I love that. And it runs really nicely into my next question, which was going to be like, do you like to document your own features? And it sounds like we need to supervise for each other and be that second pair of eyes. Even in the case where, you know, we're asking the original developer or documenting our own features, we also need to get somebody else to look it over. So never go alone is what I'm taking from Jen already pre-answering my next question. That's really, really nice. Awesome.
Sorry.
Go for it.
I was going to say, I think Jen mentioned something before as well that was really related to that, which is the idea of mental models and being able to kind of understand, okay, what system model am I being asked to interpret and what abstractions am I being presented with to interpret this? And I think as someone who has implemented a feature, in many degrees, you are an expert in that feature, right? And the way you approach that feature and talk about it is going to be very different to the way someone who needs to learn that feature will talk about it. You know, there might be some like NPM package that you didn't quite understand what it did, but it just worked, so you pushed it, and that's great. But fundamentally, you understand like the core construct of that feature, and having someone who doesn't understand that but is capable of translating that experience into a mental model that, you know, can be picked up by someone new to the project or new to the feature. I think that's so important. So yeah, I would say, you know, completely agree. Whenever possible, if you are the expert in a domain, you need to have that kind of someone who can translate that into a beginner's perspective or an all-round perspective.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And I think I'm on board with that. And I think we're talking a little bit about people who are quite established and already quite expert, but I would also like to know kind of what your advice is for people looking to get started in documentation. And I know some of you have different, you know, Scott, you're serving one community in particular. Jen, you have your open source contributors, and Cameron, you're involved with the Season of Docs as well. Is that a good place for complete beginners?
So Season of Docs is actually not a good place for beginners per se, because the way it has been set up is to go and get experienced tech writers to come in and help open source communities go in and do stuff. And I probably should take a step back and say, what is Season of Docs? It's sponsored by Google. I probably should just caveat and say that I actually work at Google, and I'm not actually on the Season of Docs project. And so I'm talking not on behalf of Google as I say this. So yeah, it is about going in and getting money given to an open source project to go in and get a tech writer to come in and improve your docs in some way. And there's sponsorship available, and it's open, and you can go and apply right now to be a project to get one of these tech writers. One of the things that I think is worth thinking about, and I'm going to run into a question I think we should be asking ourselves, is if you're a project, what can you do to improve your docs? And I actually think probably one of the best things to do, and what I've done in some of my open source projects, is you start with an audit. You just get someone to go through and look at your docs, and ideally get a tech writer to do this if you can get access to one, and just go and list all the documentation you have, and then get some criteria and say, is this documentation complete? Is it up to date with the latest version? How long is it? And you can, and there's a whole bunch of criteria that you can actually put on this. This is something that you can potentially go and get a Season of Docs person to come in and do, and then give your community direction on how to keep your docs maintained. Because one of the problems with docs is you can go and get someone to come in and write a document for you, and 2 days after they walk out of the office, they're out of date. What's your process to keep your docs maintained? Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Go on, they're nodding. Come on, people.
I have a couple thoughts. So one of the challenges for some of the projects I work on is that they're too big for any one person to hold in their minds whether things are up to date or correct. And so the approach that I have taken is to work to create a community and an environment where people reach out proactively with feedback, and that I reach out to them. Definitely a read through does help catch things that are like blatantly incorrect. That is a really important part of regular doc maintenance. But I found that just like getting user feedback on what the pain points are also helps me to direct effort, because I may want to do things like sync up all of my examples to be about the same sort of like user story. I might think that's good. I might notice that as I'm reading that, like, oh, that's annoying. But if I listen to the users and I ask them, they may say like, oh, this is that one part that trips everybody up and we made like this whole internal tutorial at our company to help people understand it. And like, those are like targeting those areas are a really good first step when trying to level up docs.
Yeah, I think if you're like a complete beginner, which I think was the context of the question, right? Sorry if I'm missing that. But yeah, I think if you're a complete beginner, like one of the best things to try is to try and document someone else's project or someone else's feature, and not just like ambush them with documentation. Like if you're, I don't know, if you're lucky or unlucky, depending on your perspective, enough to work in a tech company, maybe a small team, and you are a decent developer but don't have documentation experience, then ask folks in that team who have more experience, can I try and document one of your features, and will you tell me what you think of this documentation? Or if you are looking to kind of get into the industry as someone focused on docs, or if you're looking to contribute more to open source, find a small open source project, not like a huge one excuse me, not like a huge one that's already got thousands of active contributors and something like that. Find a small open source project with a maintainer that is actively looking to create a safe space, and that can be quite hard to find amongst all the noise that goes on in tech projects, but there are folks out there who are crying out for that kind of input and that kind of help, who are willing to work with people new to the industry and willing to give feedback, because it benefits them, but also there's more to open source than just contributing code. And I think if there's a number of people, and I'm sure anyone in the Discord or anyone here knows better than me some of the communities around that, but just try and document and try and find a safe space to do that, and just start on something small, start on something that you haven't built, and see how that feels, see what kind of impact you can have on a project without contributing code to it, because it's a great feeling. And I think people need to be more welcoming to those kind of contributions, and if you can find small projects that do that, then great. Like, you are going to encounter people who have the same goals as you, which is to improve documentation, right? And open source is a great way to try something you're maybe not super great at and take it to that next level where it can go into an open source project and stuff like that. So yeah, find a small project and with a nice empathetic maintainer, and just start trying to contribute doc changes rather than code changes.
I would love to offer up RST to PDF as a recommended small and friendly project, and I already have some tickets open on that. It's and as a maintainer, even though I'm a writer, I'm also a maintainer, so there's just a lot going on. RST to PDF has a very interesting problem in that it has a lot of documentation. It's all terrible. And it's outdated, and it was written by a developer. Like, it's not task oriented at all. So I'm doing a whole load of examples. And the nice thing about that is people ask me a question and then I make them write the example so that next time we have a question, we have the answer, and it kind of scales up. So even though most of our users are not writers, they're very technical, then this is achievable for them, and I'm there in the review process to help and keep things moving. And maybe just, especially if you are not very confident in the way that you structure your writing, or if you're a non-native English speaker, bring it on. That is the least of my worries. I can fix that stuff, and with love and welcome. The projects, like Scott says, are definitely out there, and we finding them is difficult. And I know that it can be, documentation can seem like a big thing that other people do, and actually it's could you add a paragraph here to make this simpler, or an example, and if we all did that, it would all be better. That the small improvements are also worth a lot, but I think also it's not that unusual for people to try to contribute to open source and not necessarily have a great experience first time, and they end up feeling like open source isn't for them, when actually, it's like looking for Mr. Right. There is a project out there for you. And if you didn't find it yet, then you need to just keep on looking. Awesome. Cool. We've got a few more questions coming in. Jen, I know we are putting pressure on you for time. Is there anything you want to tell us or share with us on this topic before we let you run off, and we'll continue the conversation between ourselves?
Just like to share a word of encouragement for anyone who's interested in contributing to documentation. Just a reminder, you don't need to be an expert on something. I love it when people who are not experts come and help offer improvements, offer feedback. A lot of the docs I work on are aimed at beginners, and so hearing from beginners and having their participation is really, really important and always welcome. So thanks, Ben, for having me. Enjoy the rest of the conversation.
Lorraine, I think you're on mute.
There we go. I knew the technology was going to catch me. Either you're going to hear me typing or you're going to not hear me talking. There's no way that I can consistently get this right over this period of time. My current employers are 2 hours ahead of me in time zone. So it's now 8 p.m. here. I've run out of brain. Awesome. So I'm going to make you two do the work and tell me a bit about, we're here at a user group in a community today, but which other communities do you participate in this sort of education, documentation, writing space? What other groups have you found helpful, or what other communities do you participate in?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. There is a Write the Docs community, and they have conferences. They have a really active Slack channel, which is where I'd suggest starting for anyone who's saying, I want to get into docs. Where do I start? And you just see lots of people coming in saying, I'm a lone tech writer in an area. How do I do such and such? Tons of those questions and lots of help. So I'd suggest going there. Scott, have you got thoughts on that?
I'm just going to get in the way of Scott. I'm a huge fan of Write the Docs. It's a place you can find me there almost all the time in their Slack channel. And between, the good docs and Write the Docs, there are a bunch of resources that I really rely on when I need to work on documentation. I think we've discussed I'm not really a specialist writer, but it's my favorite developer advocate task. So it's something that I hope that I'm growing into. And I think it's something that, much like a lot of the other tech roles, you can absolutely get into and excel at without a formal education. I meet lots of interesting people who did other things first. Maybe different types of writing, maybe not. And I think there's the documentarian community. They also write notes with a pen, just like me. The documentarian community is diverse in a whole load of unexpected ways, as well as the ones that we normally talk about. And I like that. I think it's a real strength.
Yeah. I think for me, I'm probably not the most community-minded person in my spare time, which is kind of funny seeing as I'm on this panel. But yeah, I think one thing that worked for me when I was writing my book, which I'm surprised I got this far in without mentioning, so go buy it. It was like local writer groups, and obviously the times we're in right now is pretty difficult, but finding places where you could just go with other folks who had projects on and kind of just like, even if you just all have your headphones on at the same time with a coffee and work through stuff. But, stuff like that has been really nice to have. Like for me, it's more about like small or tight knit or local communities rather than wider stuff. But I would encourage people if, specific documentation communities or specific tech communities seem overwhelming. They are for me. I find it really difficult to be a part of something that big sometimes. It's too much scope for my brain. I like small things. I like quiet things a lot of the time. So I think finding like a small group of friends of similar interests, or for me, if I'm working on like a more like illustrative project, like art groups where everyone goes and draws together and stuff like that are great. But yeah, like I think seeing documentation as well as a craft and embracing like community around craft, not so much around. Well, sorry, alongside the more like technical side of things is really useful for me. And I think, you know, writing around other writers or designing around other designers or anything like that is always a great experience. And it's something small you can start like early on. Like it doesn't have to be big communities of documentation writers, right? Or as great as they are. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm saying there's other approaches for.
Well, and for me, they've been big and small. You know, Write the Docs is a global movement with a big Slack channel. And there's a group, not quite in my hometown, but less than an hour from here, which is normally 4 of us in a bar. So we've had bigger meetups, we've had smaller meetups. They're an amazing support group for me. So they are both my small and local. They are Write the Docs are the people that I run into at every other event and find. And they're also a big community in their own right. And I would say the same about API the Docs. Like you say, times are different. They're online and they're doing like a series of events rather than one big conference. And then they occasionally do a London meetup, which I arrange important meetings in London to be in town for the evening meetup, which is, yeah, which is a good way to meet the communities. But again, it's been both Write the Docs and API the Docs are big and small and in lots of different places. So I hope that they would also, you know, meet a bunch of needs, not just specifically yours. I think it's a good way to get to everyone.
I wouldn't mind actually jumping in and talking about some of the problems we have with open source and documentation. And there's a bunch of surveys. There's a GitHub survey out which sort of said that 93% of, if I quote it right, 93% of projects have people don't like the docs in them. And there's other stuff like people leave projects because the documentation is bad. Like we have a serious problem with regards to documentation. And I've actually gone in and wrote an essay a while back about, like, I went in and did a deep dive on one open source project and worked out what their problems were with documentation and how we could fix it. And it was really hard. And one of the problems is it's actually quite difficult to get people to work on documentation because the users of the product quite often aren't programmers. And what we do is we come in and say, hey, can you please write the documentation for us? They say, yeah, really keen, love to. And then the next thing we say is, okay, go and get a GitHub account, go in and learn Git, go in and learn Markdown. And they get completely thrown because, all they're used to before that was using Microsoft Word, or, if they're lucky, they might have been using one of the other, slightly better versions, like more technical versions. We lose them at that point. And one of our biggest problems that we have is that we get people to start out in Google Docs or something like that, and then we have to go and convert it into GitHub or some Git type thing at the back end, and that whole process is hugely messy. And if you're sitting there with an open source project you want to try and solve, this one would help the most people around the world in open source by just nailing this one problem. And I guess probably the small part of this is really help your tech writers come into the community and hold their hands as much as you can and try and simplify your documentation process as much as possible. Expect that they will say, yeah, it's okay if you're writing Google Docs. I'm okay with that. I'll step back from there. I could keep on going for hours on this topic.
Yeah, this. I feel like don't want to plug too much, but like that's a big problem we're trying to solve at Gitbook is around. So first of all, like the idea that a technical team doesn't necessarily mean a development team. If you're sharing the Gitbook link site, by the way, we literally launched a redesign about 2 hours before I joined this thing. So go find some bugs or whatever.
I once had a company launch a full rebrand on a site that I was in the middle of a live demo of streaming.
Nice. Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Please tell us about Gitbook Because I just
Yeah,
said the word on your intro, but I didn't explain what it was. So I think context works really well, and you should plug it at least a little bit.
Cool. That's good. Meet my contractual obligations. I think, it's something where we see a lot is, okay, we started this documentation as a team of developers. We started this product, this startup, whatever, as a team of developers. And we created all our documentation as Markdown files in GitHub. And now we've grown, and now our product is real. It's all grown up. We've got funding. We've gone through some growth phases, whatever it is. Our team is bigger. And now we have folks who should be contributing to the documentation, but we have all these barriers in place. Exactly what Cameron is saying. Go sign up to GitHub. Go, learn how to use Git. Go, like, whether that's downloading the desktop app or learning the command line. There's another thing to try and learn. Oh, okay, but which command line tool are you going to use? Like, it's a black hole, right? And before you know it, you've like anyone you're trying to onboard to contribute into your documentation is like, oh, okay, I'll leave it to you. So like something we've really tried to solve with Gitbook is that relationship between, okay, we don't want to take away the way developers are used to documenting their tools, but we also don't want that process to kind of be undemocratic. So like we have Git sync as part of like our core feature set. It's probably like the thing that kind of, I wouldn't say we're most proud of as a team, because we do like the product a lot, but yet something that like we really want to get right, and we really want to keep improving, because it's that two-way conversation from Gitbook to GitHub, or the Git providers are available, and from your Git provider back into your Gitbook documentation. If we can make that seamless, to me, that breaks down the barrier. And there's already so many barriers in place for people writing documentation, right? Exactly what Cameron was speaking about. So I think, we haven't solved the problem yet. That's why we're still working on it and trying to improve it. But I think it's so important to democratize access to contributions, whether you're trying to encourage folks in your team or your company to contribute, or you're trying to get contributions from the wider open source community. So that was a really long plug, but also it's something we care about. It's something we really do.
Well, and I think the discussion of tools is really relevant and really important for this. And it depends also on the community that you serve. So I have just gone in exactly the opposite direction and ripped some sort of, let's do Google Docs and then spend time making someone a secretary to move it back into Git, when everyone who writes would be happier in some sort of markup. And Git, we're making the engineers figure out how to use a word processor. And then we're trying to simplify their stuff back down to Markdown. It makes no sense. But that's very specific to that technical audience. Yep. That RSD to PDF, it's a Python command line tool. Like, it's kind of self-selecting in lots of ways. Sphinx wraps it. It's more complicated than that. But essentially, that's kind of where we are. So it depends a little bit on your community. But if, like Cameron says, you have a community who want to contribute to something that they don't really interact with via GitHub, but it is open source, and therefore the docs are open source, it might be that you need to find the appropriate tool for the appropriate community that is going to be contributing. Whereas we have some kind of over-engineered, terrible, I don't want to be too rude about it, because it's obvious which one it is at Ivan, but I'm replacing it with a developer portal that will be, put your structured markup files in this directory, and we'll do the button, and it will obviously be under source control, because all contributors are either developer advocates or engineers. So we don't really need anything else. And but those are our familiar tools. For people who need different familiar tools, that's the key. And I think that's the point that you're trying to make. I think there's some really good, I'm seeing a bunch of questions coming past. It's all good. One of them is about, and I saw another question go past before, about dark mode. And I want to tie that to this question about accessibility. Is it something that is important with documentation? Does doing it with open source make a difference? What advice do you have in this space?
My I have a very personal relationship with dark mode because I tend to not use products that don't have it. For me, it's quite specific. I get really bad migraines sometimes, and for me, like being able to switch everything to dark mode, lower the brightness and stuff like that. I'm not advocating working through a migraine, but sometimes they're just niggling enough for me to need to make some accommodations in my day-to-day. So that's really useful. The actual data and metrics on whether dark mode improves readability for certain folks is not substantiated. So I'm speaking from personal experience, but it's something I've, I think, again, reading experience, accessibility as a designer who works for a documentation platform, it's like something I have to focus on a lot, right? But yeah, I think for people with certain kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, certain kind of like, not so much disabilities, but things that affect them, like especially around like their eyes and stuff like that, it can be really useful. And then there's the fact that it's now an operating system preference, and one of the I guess the core tenets of accessibility is respect operating system defaults wherever possible. So yeah, every documentation should have a dark mode.
Yeah, and I'll probably jump in on top of that and sort of say that we're software engineers, or I'm suspecting most of us on this call probably have a background in this. And we should go in and, like software engineering, break these concepts down into different modules. And we regularly run into, when we go and say, hey, we're going to sort out the documentation, the first thing our software engineers go and do is we say, okay, let's go in and focus on getting the tool chain right. But that's a different problem. There is a toolchain problem that you probably have to sort out. There is also the way you present the content, and you do need to think about that. But there is also just the pure, what words do you put on a page? How do you structure the document? And each of these problems should be addressed separately. And within the within the Good Docs project, what we have said is we want to bite off the problem of what are the words, what is the structure of a good document. And then you go in and you get someone else like Scott who is going in and working on a different part of that problem.
My angle is that I'm a disabled user. I have accessibility needs. I'm keyboard only most of the time. So for the projects there are these like, they're kind of frames, but they're not. The left-hand bar kind of scrolls. I probably can't focus it. Like divs are currently my nemesis on the internet. Used to be hover JavaScript, that's gone out of fashion. Pretend divs, pretend scroll bars, pretend text areas. Huge problem for me. But if you store your documents in the open, and I can see that fork me on GitHub or improve this page banner, awesome. I can pull that and use my own tooling. So for plain text markup, open source, docs source, I can pull that and either render it or, like I'm a Vim user. I read Markdown, it's fine. I will just pull those locally. So it's beyond just having it in dark mode, having it in high contrast and those kinds of things. It's, here is the content, have at it. We have a rendering, but maybe you would like a rendering too. So for me, that's been a huge door opener. My background is in I've been doing a lot of API stuff the last few years. And if you publish your API description, I can render it in tools that work for me, because hardly any of the automatic API reference docs renderers, like I say, I can't scroll. I think some of them work fine.
Sorry, I jumped in then.
I was about to jump in and take another topic. Scott, did you have more to add to that?
Yeah, just super quick though. Like I think there's much more to accessibility than I think what we're used to as software engineers as well. I think people see accessibility, overgeneralizing here, but as like hitting a certain score on Lighthouse, for example, or hitting a certain score for an accessibility audit. But I think, Cameron, you touched on it previously. It's about the words you use. It's about understanding as well how different people have different approaches to learn and to consuming information and being aware of that. And it's about understanding that as well, that when you are asking someone to read something, you have their attention and you need to be doing something positive with that attention. And I think, yeah, it's easy to say we need to make docs accessible so screen readers can read them, and we need to make sure that every image has an alt attribute and all that stuff. Super important. But there's a side to accessibility that is underexplored in the software engineering world, and I think it revolves around maybe the more personal associations people have with consuming information. How AlexJS that Jen was talking about earlier is an amazing example of that, because it brings people into an environment where they have to assess how accessible their language is. And we're not talking about the technology that people are creating or the tools that people have to use to consume that. Massive part of accessibility, yes, but there's an underlying part of the idea of accessibility that's about making sure that no matter what your physical disability is, no matter what any of your neuroatypical qualities might lead you to prefer or to need, no matter where you fall on any kind of spectrum, like that, we are creating stuff that can be consumed by as many people as possible, because that's what brings people into communities like this, and not doing that is what excludes people from communities like this. So it's a very weighted term, accessibility, and I think like if we broaden our definition of it, especially in open source and community driven approaches, like to me it's really important that when we speak about accessibility, it's much broader than just the tools or being screen reader friendly and stuff like that.
Although if people did have a good Lighthouse score, that would also not hurt.
Oh yeah,
I have to say, because it is quite good at, what it can't tell is this is a span and it clearly should be a link. Yeah. So it's got some sort of click. Anyway, I just want to say also there's a really awesome link in the Discord channel. So if you're logged into Discord, click there for more stuff about tips for creating accessible documentation that looks incredibly helpful. Okay, so we have actually less than 10 minutes left now. And since I have people who are kind of key into particular projects, I'm going to set you head to head here, and I want you to tell me whether you can good docs with your Gitbook or Gitbook with your good docs. Is that a thing?
I'll take the first crack at this. I sort of hinted at this earlier with regards to saying that we're focusing on templates, and Scott's focusing on a different part of the problem. And I'm going to try and hit Scott up afterwards and say, hey, Scott, we should talk about how we should collaborate on this, because what we are wanting to be able to do is to be able to let our documentation go into any tooling system. And help any tooling system, and so it'll be good to be able to work out how that relationship could work within the tooling that he's bringing to the table.
Yeah, I think there's work going on behind the scenes that I can't be too revealing about in relation to like templates in Gitbook, and a lot of like new work in general on our product direction. When you break Gitbook and similar tools down, it's a lot of functionality wrapped around a markdown style editor. So at the end of the day, as long as you can get template content into something that looks a little bit like markdown, like compatibility and bijection or whatever is not trivial, but it's not a huge tech problem for us to crack and spend months on, right? So yeah, I think templates are so powerful. I think we've had numerous conversations today about the power of templates, especially in providing direction to folks who maybe are less confident about how docs should be structured and stuff like that. So I'm sure you could take some of Cameron's and the other folks involved, take their templates and get them into Gitbook right now. You could do that. Maybe we can make it easier. Maybe we should. But yeah, I'm sure it's possible.
I wouldn't mind just jumping in, because I'm assuming there's people on this call who are projects who are wanting to say, okay, what are my next steps? And I started off by saying, do an audit. I'll also want to say, write less docs. And I actually wrote, I had a whole presentation at a tech writing conference where I started out by saying, all you tech writers, stop writing, write less. I didn't get cheered on that point. But the less documentation you write, the less you have to maintain. And maintaining documentation is one of our biggest problems. And And if you are writing less docs, it means that you have to make your product better and more intuitive. And that's the ultimate goal, is to actually make an intuitive product. So yes, you do need to have docs. Yes, you do need to have a bare minimum of them. Try and work out how you can do it in such a way where you've got less docs and you push out your there's certain types of docs that it's okay if they're not up to date. Sort of the FAQ or the community forum type stuff that people can search on. It really doesn't matter if they're out of date. So see if you can work out your documentation strategy and think about all your different doc types and start with your auditing of your documentation and seeing what you really need to keep perfect.
Yeah, I'd jump in on that with Cameron with design your docs as well. And I don't mean design as in like the visual designs of them. I mean, sit there and, like this comes natural to me. So I might speak about this like it's super obvious, and I know it's not. This has been my career for, I don't even want to count the years, but a long time. And to write better docs and to write any kind of better communication, to communicate better, you need to understand where you're failing. You need to understand what pain points and what points of friction you're putting into place. What are people encountering in your documentation that are making them just, like Cameron was saying before with the survey, just give up? I don't want to do this. What are those specific pain points? What opportunities are there behind those pain points for you to improve your docs, for you to improve documentation as a whole, as a concept? What do people struggle with across the board with documentation? What do they struggle with specifically with yours? And how are you going to tackle those pain points going forward? How are you going to measure the success of your documentation? I think it's quite easy to write documentation, not get any feedback on it, and assume it's doing a great job. But I would argue that if you have the resources, and maybe this is less of an open source issue. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit conflated here, but I think if you do have the resources and you care about documentation, applying those resources to testing it and iterating on it and understanding how your documentation makes people feel is really important. And there's a lot of kind of design techniques. There's a really good book by, I think it's Lorna Mitchell. I'm really butchering that name. It's called The User's Journey. And that's a really good introduction if you are really interested in documentation and writing and storytelling, but want some approaches to apply that to a design method or a design approach, then that's a really great starting point. But you can design your documentation. Your documentation is supposed to solve needs. To solve the needs, to solve the problems, you need to be aware of them. You need to be aware of the context that they're happening in. And for me, the way I approach that is to just try and design it. Try and just do the stuff I would do when I'm testing a prototype with documentation. And it helps that a big part of my work is how good the documentation produced by it is. But at the same time, you can sit someone down with your documentation and watch them try to read it. And I guarantee that will be a humbling experience for someone.
It always is. Yeah, I think there's some really good stuff there. And I definitely agree that we need to... Documentation is not a thing that you do. Like, it's not like you've completed the task, tick. It's never really finished, even less so than maybe product features, to kind of keep that software engineer perspective. That's even less true for documentation. Your point about you should always be iterating, bearing in mind the structure. For me, I find often the good information is there, but it's difficult to find, and I think this is Cameron's point about if there's like more is not necessarily more. If you can't find anything, then you might as well throw the whole lot away, and perhaps just put in 10 things you actually need. More is not always more, and having it well organized. And I get a kick from deleting documentation exactly as I do from deleting code, knowing that we are making it better, making it simpler, and bearing in mind our audience. We touched on the accessibility about the reading age and good structure and semantic content. I think there's a whole bunch of things here. You're making me think in a good way. It's good. We're a little bit running out of time, sort of coming to the end. Is there anything either of you, I'm going to ask each of you in turn, that you would like to, any parting thoughts you would like to leave us with? Cameron, go.
Okay, so if you want to get involved in writing, if you're a tech writer wanting to get involved in writing and you want to do something awesome for the community and would like to contribute to our project, at this point we're taking our templates to the next level and we're looking for people to adopt a template, take ownership of it. This is a heavy lift. It is going to involve going in and researching the internet, going and finding what you think is the best practices out there, and then proving that it is the best in the world, and then putting it inside the framework we've put in place. So if you want to be involved, come along to the Good Docs project, jump onto our Slack channel, and we'd love to see you. Or alternatively, go and have a look at our older templates if you need them for the moment, and do a doc audit of your project. At some point, you'll do wonders for your project.
Amazing, thank you. Scott, any parting thoughts from you?
Yeah, I'm going to do 2 quick plugs and then a parting thought. So Gitbook is free forever for open source communities. If you have a public repo and you want to create documentation for that, then you get a whole bunch of features that we would charge normal companies for free forever. If you are interested in some of the approaches you can take to documenting and designing your documentation, then I have a lot of good starter content in my fabulous book called Mindful Design, which you should absolutely buy so I can pay some rent. And yeah, I think the parting comment I would make is that I'm sure there's a lot of people here who maintain open source projects, and there's people here who hold some sway in the open source world, in the communities. And I think really focus and think about the safe space you can provide folks who want to contribute stuff to your projects that isn't code. And think about how quickly you might dismiss a non-code contribution or a non-code issue compared to how quickly you might accept a code-based PR or start investigating a code-based issue. I think there's a huge focus in open source, and people get to see the impact straight away of code-based contributions. And it can feel like sometimes that's the only way to contribute to an open source project. That's not true. And we need, as maintainers and as members of a community, or however we might see ourselves, we need to take responsibility to say, I am looking for more than just code-based contributions. I am going to take this suggestion of how to make my documentation more inclusive as seriously as I'm going to take this PR that fixes an annoying bug in my CLI, and create an environment that democratizes different disciplines. Because at the end of the day, documentation is going to tell the story around your product. It's going to show people what they can do with your product. And if you're failing them at that point, then it doesn't matter how great your product is, to be fair. You need to get people in through how you talk about it and how you show them what they can do with it. So create a safe space. Make sure that you are seen publicly to be asking for and accepting documentation contributions, accessibility contributions, everything that isn't just code. Yeah, code is important. Everyone knows that. That's the backbone of open source. Everyone knows that you can submit a PR and your code can get merged and you feel great by doing that. Let folks who can't or don't want to contribute code get that same feeling, recognize that same impact through other as meaningful contributions.
Yeah, that was a really nice parting thought. I think for me, I just want to echo the advice to get to participate, to get involved in the different projects. And like I say, if you've tried open source before, then and you didn't find your place, keep looking, because there are projects out there that need you. All right. Thank you so much to Cameron, to Scott, of course, to Jen when she was here for the panel, and to Jen especially for the talk this evening. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me. And just to wrap up then with a little bit of closing housekeeping, so you know what's coming up in this community in the coming weeks. You should be back here in 2 weeks, where the topic of the night will be data. So it's a good chance to come and find out a bit more about it. Again, we'll have great content for you, good crowd in Discord, and your questions are welcome, as they always are. Thanks so much to our organisers tonight, to everyone who joined in, the presenters that you've seen on camera, the chat that's going on social media and on Discord. It's been amazing, and I hope to join you again at some point in the future. Thanks, everyone.